Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about Math 8 integers, just for as a series for students who want to get ahead or are needing a little boost in something. So the first question we can ask is, what is an integer? So we can first contrast this with what is a whole number. Whole number. Now, for those of you who don't know, a whole number is any number that is positive, including zero, and it is not including decimals. So an example would be 1, 2, 3, 4, any sort of counting numbers. And this is not including something decimal. So you wouldn't count 1.1, 2.2, or whatever as a whole number. However, you would also include 0 as part of the whole numbers. Now, the difference with a whole number and an integer is that integers essentially also count in 0, but also have positive and negative values. For instance, an integer might include -1, -2, -3, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now, what's also interesting about integers is that they also count in decimals, or so values you can have values such as -1.1, +2.2, and so on and so forth. First thing we should know is how to add integers. Integers, you can imagine them as being part of a number line. Imagine we have an imaginary number line that starts with 0 here, and we can have 1, 2, 3 in the positive end of the number line. And we can also have -1, -2, -3, parts of the negative parts of the number line. So any number that would fall on this section will be considered a positive integer, and any part that will be any number from this section would be considered a negative integer. Now, to add an integer or subtract an integer, you can consider them as moving. Let's say you're in this spot here. This is you. We can draw a stick man. If you were to add 2 steps, you would be moving 2 steps forwards here. So you would be here now. Now, let's say you wanted to subtract 2 steps, then you would be in this part of the number line. The idea to illustrate here is that you had a value of 1, and by adding 2, you have now become 3. But then when you subtract 2, you have a value of -1. So this sort of idea of working with negative numbers is something that you should be familiar with for other stuff as well. An example is, let's say you have $100 in the bank. Let's say we can draw a bank here, big money sign and a door. But let's say you wanted to take out $1,200 from the bank. Because let's say you have a little toy, or let's say there's a candy that you really want that costs $1,200. And intuitively, you don't have $1,200 in the bank right now, but you want to have 1,200. So if you ask for a loan, you can subtract 1,000 minus 1,200, and that's going to get you -200. And so your your net worth, or whatever you have in the bank right now, is going to be a negative number, -200. Now, aside from just adding and subtracting, you can also multiply and divide integers. The rules for multiplying and dividing integers is as follows. When you multiply two positive integers, you will get another positive integer. If you multiply a positive integer and a negative integer, you will get a negative integer. And if you multiply two negative integers, you get a positive integer. Now, this can be illustrated also in a number line. Imagine that we have an imaginary number line of all the integers possible here. Imagine you are in this position, at position 1 of the number line. If, let's say, we were to multiply your position by 2, positive 2, you can write the equation as this. 1 multiplied by 2, positive, is going to be equal to 2. So you would be able to jump to 2 here. Let's say you wanted to instead multiply it by 3. Then you would be able to become 3 here. One way of thinking this is a positive value would imply the direction of which you're looking, forward or backwards, right or left. For instance, because you're at position +1, you will be looking to the right, and you would be wanting to move forwards. And then by multiplying by 2, you'll be moving forwards here. If you multiply by -2, on the other hand, you'll get -2. So you would be moving here instead. Now, this might be intuitive or not intuitive for you to think, but you can think of it as a person. If you were to think about adding, you can think of it as a person with a direction. Let's say they're at position 1, at position +1, then they're looking essentially this way if you're adding, and you're looking this way if you're subtracting within the frame of the number line. So what do I mean by this? Let's say you're adding +1. That means you're going to move right 1 step. And if you move right 1 step, you're going to get to number 2. But let's say you're at position 1 and you want to move backwards. How do you do that? Well, if you want to subtract a number, you can go to the left. So if you subtract 1 step, +1 step, you're going to be at 0 now. Be here. Another way to look at it is, what if your position began at -1? What if this is your person here? If you begin at -1, it still works the same. If you want to move to the right, you would, or if you want to add steps, you would move to the right. And if you want to subtract steps, you would move to the left. It works the same as that. But let's say we have something funky. You wanted to subtract a negative step. How would this work? Imagine that the person at the position -1, first, because we know that it's a subtraction, he would have to move to the left. But because he's subtracting a negative number, he would move backwards to the left instead of moving forwards to the left. Imagine forwards being this direction and backwards being opposite. So instead, he would be moving to 0 here. You can think of positives and negatives as forwards and backwards. And in terms of the number line, you can think of it even as right and left. One thing I would like to mention is you can think of integers as relative positions to 0. For example, adding +1 to -1 is going to equal 0. So you can think of them, instead of thinking of them as specific numbers, as whether or not a distance from 0, whether positive or negative. Now, one way you can write integer addition and multiplication is using these brackets. These brackets make it easier to understand what you're doing, whether it's you're adding a positive integer, adding a negative integer, subtracting a positive integer, or subtracting a negative integer. You can write +1 minus -1. Again, remember our rules that we went over. Two positives make a positive and a negative make a negative, but two negatives make a positive. So +1 minus -1 could be written as +1 plus 1. Because of our rule, two negatives make a positive. Another thing we can, sorry, this makes 2. Another thing to understand is this rule also applies to addition, to multiplication and division. If you were to multiply positive 3 times negative 4, what number would you get? You will get negative 12. Remember, this is because a positive multiplied by a negative is always going to end up with a negative number, whereas two negatives will be a positive and two positive will be a positive. When doing multiplication with integers, you can first establish whether or not the number will be positive or negative, and then establish the value of the number, whether by multiplying the 3 and the 4. You can first ignore the signs to determine the sign of the answer, and then focus on the numbers themselves. Another example could be negative 4 times negative 2. Using our little formula here, we know this will be positive, and this will be positive 8. Another example might be positive 3 times positive 8, which is going to be equal to positive 24. With division, it is about the same. It is the same principles as multiplication, and we can do some right now. We can do a question like positive 7 divided by positive 4. This would equal 7 over 4. This would be positive, following the rules. We can also resolve something such as negative 8 divided by positive 2. This would be equal to negative 8 over 2. And if you simplify this, you'll find that this is equal to negative 4. Another example, negative 4 divided by negative 4 would simply equal positive 4 over 4 should be equal to 1. Now, one bit of review that I wanted to get here as well is that when we're doing anything involving brackets, multiplying, addition, subtraction, we always need to remember the rule of BEDMAS or PEDMAS. As for BEDMAS, it discusses that first we need to work with brackets. And then we have division. This is my bad, there's not supposed to be an E. And then multiplication, addition, and subtraction. Now, what does this mean? So let's say we have a more difficult problem. Negative 28 plus negative 4. We have a bracket here. We have this being divided by 8 and then multiplied by 3. How would we resolve this question? First, we need to resolve what is within the brackets. So what we can do is we can just take a sheet of paper or anything and block out this side first. So first we can know that negative 28 plus negative 4 is going to be a negative number. And then 28 plus 4 is going to be 32. And then another thing that we can know is we can write the rest of it now. Negative 8 times 3. Now the second part of PEDMAS is going to be division. So we can first block out the neg times 3. What is negative 32 divided by 8? That is going to be negative 4. And then we have times 3 here. And lastly, this last bit, we know that a negative number multiplied by a positive number is always going to be a negative number. So now we just need to know what's 4 times 3, and that should be 12. And that is the answer that we got. This is just a brief summary of what is expected for grade 8 integers. Thank you for watching.